Well, I guess we'll get started. Welcome to another exciting chapter of the World Nobel Laureate Lecture Series. On behalf of the residents, I would like to thank management, especially Abel Jenny and Laura Flagler from Florida, and all the wonderful World employees who have helped orchestrate this event and all the other Nobel Laureate Lectures of the world. As we know, the world travels and rotates the globe on a different itinerary every year, and the owners from nearly 25 countries represents many first-generation entrepreneurs, scientists, business leaders, and importantly for this lecture, philanthropists. The Nobel Laureate Lecture Series in the past has included Drs. Myron Scholes, Economics 1997, Shuji Nakamura, Physics 2014, Edvard Moser, Medicine 2014, Brian Kabilka, Chemistry 2012, and Lech Walesa, Peace 1984. Following Lech Walesa, we have another Peace Laureate to welcome to our humble community. Today we have the pleasure of welcoming Benny Dembitzer and his lovely wife, who will be here shortly, I guess, Bertuken. Benny Dembitzer has specialized in the economics of the developing countries, particularly the continent of Africa. He was European Director of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War when the organization was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1985. The International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War was founded in 1980 to prevent nuclear war between initially Russia and the US. The IPPNW later created a spin-off, so to speak, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons in 2007. This organization went on to receive a Nobel Prize for Peace in 2017. Currently, Benny teaches a widely respected global development course run in London for NGOs, a grassroots Africa nonprofit offering agricultural advisory services for African farmers in cooperation with a number of volunteer agencies. He consults with a number of prestigious NGOs, including the Rockefeller Foundation, and has published books such as The Attack on World Poverty, Going Back to Basics, Sleepwalking into Global Famine, The World Cannot Feed 9.1 billion people, and The Famine Next Door, Africa is Burning. This latter book tries to explain how the migration crisis that has hit Europe is not the result of the attraction per se of Europe, but the need to escape what are already intolerable situations of climate change, overpopulation, degraded lands, and shortages of water. The breadth of Benny's really extraordinary experience speaks to his commitment towards working with seemingly intractable global problems, and speaks to his broad and deep capability in helping his fellow man in important issues, not only in averting nuclear war, but also sustainability, to AIDS and other diseases, to migration, financing, population control, and many, many other global issues. His resume is like an NGO who's who's list. Since the Nobel work, he has directed work of the Fund for Research and Investment for Development of Africa, United Nations Industrial Development Organization, spanning 35 countries in Africa and Asia, and for NGOs such as the International Trade Center, the World Bank, United Nations Development Program, the Dutch Aid in Indonesia, the Department for International Development on Fair Trade, the Joint United Nations Program in HIV/AIDS, Oxfam, CARE, International Voluntary Service, now called Skillshare Africa, the War on Want in Cameroon, and Amnesty International. He set up his first shop in London dealing with what is now called fair trade. Dinner with Benny, Bertuken, and Brigitte and Beat Frey last night was a personal wake-up for me on the significant hazards and wastefulness of global philanthropic investing in third world countries, of which many of us are currently undertaking or planning to undertake with our respective family charities. I expect we will hear more of this today. I would also like to make a special note to a really remarkable resident, Bridget Frey, who kindly first suggested that Benny speak, and who runs a remarkable NGO called Sustainable Organic Farming and Development Initiative in Kenya, directly providing for improved farming skills, food security, nutrition, and secure and safe water for impoverished residents. Bridget, it's an honor to know you. Today, Benny's title of his lecture is How the West Lost Africa. There will be a reception at 6 p.m. in the plaza, so please join us. Breakfast round table tomorrow at 8:30, so please join us for that too. Benny, we welcome you to the world, and we so greatly appreciate your time and that of your wife, Bertuka. I hope you have a pleasant voyage and come back to visit us again in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, or as they say in the gender-neutral woke world, dystopian world, dearest, non-binary people, things of the world, I present Benny Dembitzer. Thank you. It's all
yours. Good afternoon, everybody. And, you know, when we rehearsed what Glenn was going to say last night, I said in particular, please don't forget that there is sainthood awaiting me, and it's on the table of the Pope at the moment. So, okay. So, right, folks, I'm delighted that we start on a jocular note because I want to do the opposite of begging or of asking for funds to start a new charity or a new project or a new organization. Because what I'm going to try to do here now, and I hope we can continue during the reception and over dinner perhaps, is to put across a slight understanding of Africa, a very large continent with whom there are a large number of different groups. And Brigitte and I, in Kenya and Malawi respectively, have fallen in love because of their challenges and the way they cope with them, because of their approaches, because of their loyalty to their people perhaps, and their disloyalty to us at the same time. So I hope it's going to be a learning experience, but from time to time I'm going to ask questions to make sure that some of you are awake, okay? Right, okay, the first thing is that I wanted to make the point that Africa is very, very large and generalizations don't apply. Here is the US, here is China, here is India, there is the UK, Eastern Europe, Italy, where we are, obviously, I think, Switzerland, where the phrase comes from, Germany, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Spain. It's a big place. So please let us not generalize about, you know, all Africans are this or the other. It just doesn't apply. Right, now, where is this wretched thing? Oh, here it is. Okay. I'm not very technically minded, all right? So, look, I just thought to give you an idea. I put in alphabetical order groups across Africa that have more than 10 million inhabitants. Only those with more than 10 million inhabitants. This is because back in 2003, I think it was, UNESCO did a study of cultures, language, and civilizations across the continent, and it analyzed 2,300 different groups. Now, we got to be very different when we talk about African groups, ethnic groups, tribes, or whatever, because it can be very, very small groups of 10,000, 30,000 people, or it can be groups of several million. So I thought, just to make sure that, what I'm trying to say applies, is not only that there are the Amhara, who are probably about 15, 20 million people. No one knows for certain, and they are in Ethiopia, in Somalia, in Eritrea. Then there are the Fulanis. If there is anybody who is French-speaking, I think they're generally referred to as Peul. They are in West Africa, along the Sahelian, the south of the Sahel. I'm assuming you know that the Sahel is the zone just below the Sahara Desert, and it spreads across from West Africa, Mauritania, Senegal, all the way across to Ethiopia at the other side of Africa. Okay, so look at that. They are in Mauritania, in the Gambia, in Burkina Faso, in Nigeria, Cameroon, Sudan, etc. I was tired of writing all these names. And I wanted to show you this. Here is, in no country, they are the majority. They are one of the many groups. My wife comes from Ethiopia. There are 82 different recognized ethnic groups. And they include the Amhara, the Oromo, the Beni Sadr, who have only about 30,000 people. There are in the north, there are the Afar and the Isas. You remember Lucy under a sky, whatever, the first Homo erectus, which now is called Homo afariensis, because the area is called the Afar. You remember when that was discovered, and they were apparently playing from the Beatles and so on. She became called Lucy, the skeleton, which is a family. So here is just one element which is extremely important, and I continue with this element, which is to show the large number of people, each one of them more than 10 million people. And I want to emphasize that this starts with one of the enormous challenges of Africa, that we are talking of very, very different groups. And we're not talking of, say, Germans and French, because they are, as far as we know, you look at them, you wouldn't know the difference. But we're talking of very different culture, very different presentations, fashions, languages. And again, I don't want to just talk about different languages equal different races. There was a little fellow in the 1930s with a mustache, I can't remember his name, who used to say language and culture and race are one and the same. Of course they are not. That's all baloney, really. Okay, so that is one point. Very large number of people, very large number of cultures. And of course, as population grows, the problems multiply. Now, what are the former colonial powers? You will have immediately noticed my tremendous incompetence, because the two things should have gone in one slide. But of course, I can't put it in. So there you are. So the green is the former French colonies as of 1884, when Africa was divided between the different countries of Europe. And then one here, who was there? You, young lady, who was there? Glenn?
I didn't see where you pointed. I'm looking over here.
Right. It's this gray where it says free. Who was there?
Slaves.
Who? Liberia. And who colonized that? It was created by President Monroe, right? Not to help Africans, but to repatriate African slaves. And it was never colonized because it was created. The capital is called Monrovia, after the same Chepi. And then on the other side, you've got the Italians, who also tried to get into Libya. You won't remember, because some of you are younger than me, so you can't possibly remember. And here is Ethiopia, the only country in Africa that during the whole of the 19th century, or ever before, defeated a European power, the Italians, at Adwa. And the Europeans never had the courage to go back and try because they just didn't want to have their, their tail, as it were, chased by Africans. And Ethiopia managed to remain an independent country because it was run as an empire. The emperor in Addis Ababa, which means a new flower, a city created in 1905, I think it was, and from there he governed the different states, the different ethnic groups, the different major interests running in the country. And he was playing literally the imperial role. He was marrying one of his nobles to the governor of that place. And he was taking the son of the governor of another area and keeping him at his palace. And they all became kind of thing, his dependents. He was the puppeteer. He was the marionette master. And that is why Ethiopia managed to stay independent and so powerful. All right, the Italians colonized it for 6 years, but the Germans colonized France for 6 years, but we never referred to Ethiopia, to France as having been colonized. Okay, what are the challenges of Africa? I put them in the order that I think matters. You will have other ideas. Population. The population of Africa varies between 2 and 2.7%. Now, at 2.5%, a population doubles every 20 years. Okay? Now, no nation in Europe is at present replacing itself. The birth rate across Europe, not in the States, you're always an exception, across Europe, there is no nation, even the Catholic countries, Spain, Portugal, Italy, France, are reproducing themselves. They are diminishing, perhaps 1.1, 1.2% per annum, and that is not enough to replace the indigenous population. And if it were not for the immigrants or for catastrophes that have happened from time to time, like five years ago when about 800,000 Syrian refugees were admitted by Germany, or in the UK, where we are still receiving a large number of regular, as opposed to regular immigrants from South Asia, our population would also decrease. Okay, so tremendous challenges. Some countries are growing much more. Niger, for example, the average woman, God, who is an average woman? Now, she has not been invented yet, but young women between 15 and 35 have, on average, believe it or not, 7 children. They are pregnant throughout their lives. Now, can you imagine what does that imply to the woman, to the family, and to the children? It means no freedom for the woman, absolutely none. Too many children in the world, too many mouths to feed in a situation in which food production, as I shall try to say in a minute, does not increase, and the family grows and grows. And there is one element, above all, that I refer to here. I'll come back to that. Okay, the population is growing. Now, that means because of traditions across the entire continent, exactly as we in the West have a tradition that you leave the bulk of your money to your children, in Africa, you leave your land to your boys. Okay, you divide it. There are a few matrilineal countries in Africa, for example, the Chewe in Malawi and Mozambique and other groups like that. But by and large, the land is divided, and there is virtually only it will be in the next slide. Not enough land for a family to grow food. Now, there is no way of heating your food or heating your home at night. And there are countries that are extremely cold at night and extremely hot during the day. The Sahara, the temperature goes down to 0.5 centigrades at night, and it may be 45, 50 during the day. So you need to have fuel. Fuel, there is only one thing, and that is wood. So you cut down the wood. Rural exodus sounds a very technical word. It only means that you run away, you escape the countryside. You go to the city because you don't want to die in the rural areas. Migration, the better qualified people come to our countries. And more nomadism. Now, the nomads are people who, because of history and tradition, but also because of climate, have got to move from area to area to find fodder for their animals, to find water for everybody. And what is happening, and this is not my invention, I assure you, is that all the evidence is that nomadism is increasing. The World Bank calls that reverse genesis. It sounds very biblical. I'm not a biblical scholar, but it is. It just shows that there are many parts of Africa, particularly south of the Sahara, where what has happened is that the land has become so dry that nothing can grow. So there are patches where there is water, and then people have got to move from one to the other to the other. And in East Africa, in particular in Tanzania and in Kenya, it leads to clashes after clashes with the sedentary people, with the agricultural people, because everybody wants the same land. And arable land is one of the issues, one of the resources that the world has forgotten exists and is shrinking, day by day. Okay, agriculture, that needs to be more, climate change, okay. It affects the traffic much more than the temperate zones because of the shape of the earth. Since it's not round, and even if it were round, the same thing, but because it's slightly elliptical, the result is that around the tropics, the temperature is much higher. Higher temperature, for example, in Ethiopia, each of the last 3 decades, it has gone up by 0.3 Celsius per decade. That's, at this rate, the hopes to limit to 1.5 or 2 centigrades by 2050, you can forget about them totally. No chance. Now, other countries, the data are a little bit less reliable, as far as I've been able to discover. So the result is that the land dries, there is less moisture in the atmosphere, there is less rainfall, and less food production, because the soil has dried and is less productive. Right. The agriculture needs to be more productive because something like between 80 and 95% of all the population of sub-Saharan Africa, between 80 and 95, depending on different countries, live in the rural areas. Okay, now, so they've got to produce their own food. There is no other way. They cannot go to the local smart shop, to Walmart, whatever. It's just they've got to grow their own food. And if the land doesn't produce, what do? You escape. Why? Because lack of education. Again, you see, the World Bank, back in the early 50s when I was a student, I look very young, but I'm extremely old. The World Bank did a study that I remember reading as an undergraduate student back in the 50s, that even with 3 years of primary education, women became better farmers. With just 3 years. But are we going to give education to the women? No, they might start to want to vote, don't they? They might to stop wanting to be baby-making machines, don't they? They might want to stand for president. Oh, my goodness, we don't want that. So, okay, no education for the girls. Inevitably, the farmers become older, because anybody of a younger age and able-bodied will try to find a job somewhere else, work for a bigger farmer, work on some construction project, go to the cities. So inevitably, the older farmers are women farmers, because women are the most important elements of development, in the process of development. They produce the kiddies, they look after the kiddies and the older members of the family. They are the nurses of the family, nursing in the sense of looking after older people, of course, and those who are in poor health. They are the cooks, and they are immobile. Therefore, they are the farmers. And the women, we ought to be, our policies ought to be targeted towards women, and of course, you know, right, I'll tell you as an aside. A tremendously clever young Dutch woman, I think. Dutch people born in the Netherlands, like me, are always tremendously clever. This young woman did a study for the Clinton Foundation and went to villages. This is in 3 years in a row for about a couple of months a year. And she slowly discovered that the farmers, some of the farmers knew which seeds they should be planting if the weather looked, you know, propitious now, but in 3 months' time was going to be too rainy or too dry. So they knew that this particular seed or variety of seed would be the right one to plant now. But can you imagine a super clever British scientist or American scientist or Swiss scientist who works at one of the places where they do genetic modification of plants, going to say, a stupid woman from a village where she doesn't even speak the main language of her own country, she knows more than me. Oh, shit, sorry, no. No, you're not going to believe that, are you? So there is no dialogue, and the people who really know are never brought into the picture. We know best, which is a horrible situation to be. Now, smaller holdings I was mentioning simply because of population, okay? Now, the best land are being grabbed. Who by? Not by Africans, or perhaps sometime by Africans, acting often as proxies for Europeans, Americans, Middle East people, or, for example, the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Singapore acquiring big land, but particularly, of course, the Chinese are trying, the Indians are trying, much more. The Chinese tend to be Latin America, and as you know, Brazil is the second, is the most important trade contact partner of China. But the Indians are doing the same thing. They need more food for their people. Their agriculture, for all kind of reasons, which I will spare you because I've been told that I've got to finish within 3 hours today, so I'm not going to give you the sordid details of Indian agriculture, about which I know extremely little. So they need to grab land in Africa, and that's what they are doing. They are grabbing land, signing deals, and they take obviously the best land available because no country in Africa has a watertight land tenure system. Okay? In our land, in our parts of the world, we know who owns the land on which our home is built. We have a cadastre, I think, the land registry. Okay, now the U.S. arrived. The first Europeans who arrived in the U.S. met the local inhabitants, you know, the First Nation people, and I believe that, according to some story that I read, the first inhabitants were actually the first people who arrived in what is now New York were Dutch, and those of you who come from that part of the world know that New York was New Stuyvesant, if I remember correctly, to start with. Now, apparently, they went to the local Indian chief and said, right, who owns the land? And the local Indian Native American said, own the land? Come on, man, you're going to ask me who owns the water next. You're going to ask me who owns the air. So the Europeans came with legislation, because the Dutch, apparently in Europe, were the first to install land legally tenure of land. Okay, so we're talking of the 16th century, and that tradition is one that is highly developed in our societies because we have created a system. No African countries has got a solid legal framework because we are talking of a very different environment, social, economic, language, and everything. Now, hunger. No one knows for certain what the level of hunger is. 1.2 billion people is estimated to be the population of Africa now, of the whole of the continent. But more than 600 million, that is more than half, have less than $1.9 per day. Now, $1.9 per day is what the World Bank assumes on average to be the level of poverty. But because Africa is so far down that no one is near the average. In other words, the data for purchasing power, sorry to be technical, purchasing power means that a McDonald's in the US requires, 20 minutes of labor to buy, but in Africa it will take you 2 hours to buy, to earn enough to buy. So even at adjustments for local purchasing power, you have a much worse figure than that, because the differences between, when you make an average, the differences are much, much worse as far as Africa is concerned. And, for example, another index, which is not the World Bank, the Multidimensional Poverty Index, MPI, which looks at poverty in terms of possessions, access to food, number of children, access to education, access to water, access to wood, reflects a much worse situation where far, far more people, probably 80%, 1 billion people, are in poverty. And that is real poverty. Now, so that was the first group of challenges. Now let's look at the second group of challenges, because the first group, if you like, are those that are of Africa. These are of the world and the way that which we intervene and we understand it. First, you remember the size of the country. The difficulties in communication. You can't have any major road, railway, river system across a continent of that size. Come on, it was, I was reading not long ago a biography of Eisenhower. It was Eisenhower who ensured, as president, that communications across the US would be easier because when he grew up some time before the Second World War, in fact, the First World War, communicating from one part of the US to the other, the fastest way was about 2.5 days, if I remember correctly. So he built a program of roads to make sure that the different parts of the US would be fully connected. Right, now, we can't think of that in Africa. Natural barriers. The biggest deserts, well, some of the biggest deserts, the Sahara certainly, makes it impossible. This is why we always talk about North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa as being very different. But there are other issues, there are other deserts. There is the big Namibian desert. There is the Afar, the Isa desert, and there are plenty of other parts of the world where it is not possible, of Africa, that are impossible to link. Now, there are 54 independent countries, and whilst I understand we don't talk about politics on the world, there are only really 2 countries that are well governed across the whole of the continent. And they are extremely small countries, and most of you will have never heard of them. One is Botswana, that you will have heard of, because it is dominated by one ethnic group, and it has tremendous wealth in the form of diamonds, and because it has the wealth, the people in charge are able to govern, in a very patrimonial way, kind of thing, benevolent way. And everybody, 98% of the population are Tswanas, Botswana, the country of the Tswana. And, it's small. I think it's 1.2 million people. The other country that is well governed, generally, things have been wobbly of recent, is Lesotho, which is again a country in which something like 93% of the population are of one ethnic group, i.e. there are languages in common, easy communications, and there is a tradition of respecting the king. As I said, until recently there have been some wobbles, but those are the 2 countries where government function. There is no other country in Africa that has a decent government, part because some are extraordinarily corrupt, and partly because some are made of such conflicts, like Nigeria or Kenya, where genuine democracy, as we understand it, cannot function. Nigeria has got reputed to have 360 different ethnic groups, but all the people in charge come from 3 different groups: Yoruba, Igbo, and Hausa. The north, the center, the south. And the people at the top of those 3 ethnic groups, each one comprising 50, 60, can't remember, 70 million people, plus hundreds of other small groups, as I said, 260 that have been officially identified, and their language is codified, and their civilization examined and studied ad infinitum. The people at the top of those 3 groups just divide government between themselves. This year is my turn, next year is your turn, the year after is someone else's turn, leading to continuous instability. Okay, then foreign influences. I showed earlier the links that there are between Western countries and African countries. That kind of influence still continues, and it continues in terms of trade, in terms of exchanges of people, and in terms, it is also different versions of Christianity, conservative Islam, our geopolitical interest, and what most of us simply ignore is that the jihad is in full swing across Africa. Why? Because of discontent locally. People are not participating in the power, in the sharing of the power. And the result is that they take side with anybody who gives them an alternative. Now, as you well know, there is one thing which is conservative Islam that comes out of Saudi Arabia, the Wahhabis, okay, who in the compromise between the Islamic clergy of the Wahhabi persuasion and people like Mohammed bin Salah in Saudi Arabia, enables a balance in which no one has got any freedom except the people at the very top. But in addition, there is the other groups who are like the Islamic State. I think that in the States you call it Daesh, are pronounced a holy war, and they are carrying it on across the whole of the Sahel, which means from Mauritania, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Sudan, and so on. Okay, so this is the reality. We still are dividing those societies because of the different external influences. Now, hunger and poverty obviously lead to migration, continuous insecurity, and conflicts. For example, the Central African Republic, which is a small nation, which strangely enough is in Central Africa, for a long time was under domination of a bloke called Bokassa, who was mad as anything. But now the power of the state is just around the capital of Bangui. It doesn't, the power of the state, which in our society is ubiquitous, you know, through education, to maintenance of roads, to police, military, and so on. There is no state in the CAR, and there is permanent fighting between Christian and Muslims. And the CAR, in addition, now is host to the large number of people from the Wagner Group. And where is the Wagner Group from, young lady? Russia. No, you are not the young lady yet. Not yet, right. Okay. Indeed, they are from Russia. And where else have the Russians been very successful in sub-Saharan Africa? See, you're all asleep. Mali. They defeated NATO troops. The Wagner Group. You probably read about that. And you know, this is where, when we think we know what's happening, we jolly well don't know. So I thought I would give you a reality check. This permanent instability, more societies in conflict, more insecurity being created in the Sahel, in the Horn of Africa, you know, which is Eritrea, Sudan, Ethiopia, Djibouti, which is still a French colony, basically the Foreign Legion is based there. That will give you some idea of why we find that Africa is a basket case. But we are part of the forces that have made that basket case. And I personally resent, and I know plenty of my African friends who resent the image of children and mothers begging, when there are flourishing cultures which we do not understand, but we don't have the humility to admit that. And this is where I resent it. Now, okay. Right. What does the... have I exceeded the first hour yet?
No, continue.
No, I'll continue. Okay. He's the bloke who told me that I had 3 hours, you see. Now, we in the West think of a democratic agenda as being the priority for those countries. It doesn't mean a thing. Now, Brigitte will know far more than me about Kenya, but you know, you have the Kikuyu, the majority, will form the bulk of one party. The Luo, the second group, will form the majority of another group. The Kayenni will form another group, and so on and so forth. So you have alliances which we like to think are political parties leading to coalitions like they have in France or like they have in Italy. In fact, we are pitting one group against the other. We are encouraging undemocratic forces. And 10 years ago, there was a massacre after the general election in Kenya. Now, you know, the current president is fairly powerful. He's a great friend of the US. The US has got strong army presence, and the British even more, but don't mention that to anybody. So the reality is different. we have a global economic system which is grossly, grossly unfair. You see, because most of our nations in the West, but also those people that we have influenced and created, the World Bank, the IMF, the African Development Bank, and so on, all of these bodies are lending money to Africa. And they want to be repaid. Obviously, if you lend money, you want to be repaid. What can African nations do to repay? Produce more of the things they're good at. Okay? This is another Dutchman called Ricardo discovered this and said, concentrate on what you're good at producing. So Ethiopia produces more and more coffee, but of course USAID and the World Bank have created Vietnam as a major producer of coffee. So 30 years ago, the biggest coffee producer in the world was Brazil. The second was Ethiopia. And then there are something like 80 other countries that produce small quantities of the poorer quality of coffee that we use, for example, in instant coffee. But the best Arabica comes from Ethiopia. Now, Vietnam is number 2 producer. So Ethiopia has got to produce more and more coffee that it is not allowed under the WTO rules to process. It has got to sell them unprocessed. And the result is that Ethiopia, 2 years ago, these are the most recent figures that I've been able to find, is obtained $450 million in exports from its coffee. But the Netherlands, where most of that coffee or other good coffees end up to be processed, marketed, roasted, and all the other wonderful things we do to coffee, made $4.5 billion. Now, the Netherlands doesn't produce a single blooming, grain of coffee. So, but it's true for, tea from Uganda, coffee from Kenya as well. Ghana and the Ivory Coast produce cocoa. Madagascar, vanilla. Sudan, cotton, and so on. Mali, cotton, and so on. But those countries are not allowed to produce, to process those products. So they've got to produce more and more, which means more land. Malawi is number 1 exporter of burley tobacco leaves in the world. It is its main export. Now, we know, have you ever been a smoker, young man? Once upon a day, and like me, you're a good bloke. You gave it up because you realize it kills you, right? Did you know that it kills those that collects it? Because in Malawi, those who collect it are primarily small children because they've got tender fingers. They don't break the leaves of the tobacco leaves when they collect them. So 2 American universities working independently have worked out that a child of 5, 6, up to 10 years of age inhale through their fingers, not fully formed yet, the equivalent of between 25 and 50 cigarettes per day. And lastly, you didn't know, young man, that it kills the land, did you? Because after tobacco has been grown for 7 years in one piece of land, all the nutrients have gone. The land is dead forever, unless you've got the means to put nitrogen in. And who has got the money? Not the farmers I'm talking about. So we are killing the soil as well as the rest. Now, this is the reality of most African countries. They're not allowed to diversify. They are trapped in the rules. So they're not allowed to subsidies for agriculture, but of course the US is allowed, Europe is allowed to subsidize agriculture because we have learned the lessons after the Second World War, and those lessons have not died. They have not died, my friends, because all of you are much too young to remember but I just about remember, not because I witnessed it, because I heard it, in the immediate post-war period, cannibalism was rife in the Ukraine because they'd been deliberately starved by the Soviets. And men were cutting off chunks of meat from dead bodies to nourish their families. So, you know, long memories, I'm afraid, in that part of the world, of something that, I'm afraid, is being repeated because we are not allowed, or African countries are not allowed to subsidize their agriculture. They're allowed to die of hunger, encouraged. We have intellectual property rights. Of course we have got to have intellectual property rights. Glenn understands what it is far better than I do. But I don't understand why, in order to protect property rights, poor countries could not be given COVID vaccine. I can't understand that. Nice subject for a discussion at some later stage with you, Glenn. They have to open up their markets. Free trades. They cannot protect their agriculture or the little they produce. And the result of this, you know, you will all have guessed, is that there will never be industrialization in Africa. Because every single African country has arrived too late at the table of industrialization. China and East Asian countries have got there first. Right. Now, a lot of this I don't want to go on forever, and then there is no time for you to put questions to me. I want to, okay, more aid. We give more aid, and if there is weak governance, there is more corruption, isn't there? There is, but also, you know, the amount of money that when we give aid, there are always conditions. Some are more subtle than others. But for example, in Tanzania, at one stage, I think it was about 3 or 4 years ago, each donor insisted to have their own bank account. And this meant that, for example, the US Department of Agriculture, the US Department of the Treasury, the US Department of Agriculture, and the Department of Health, each were helping Tanzania, but they were not talking to one another, of course not. I mean, you know, my department is more important than yours. Who are you? Dare you? You know, I am more powerful in cabinet and the president favors me more than you, blah, 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 blah. They were forcing auditing and control systems which the local governments cannot cope with. They could not cope with, and they could not say no to anybody. Now, again, let me give you an example from Kenya. Outside Kibera, which some of you might have heard of, it's a huge dump, a huge slum outside on the outskirts of Nairobi. There is an enormous mountain of second-hand shoes. Second-hand shoes? Where from? The US of A. Why? Because some clever exporter of second-hand shoes in the USA discovered that they could export shoes that had big holes, no one could use and whatever, to Kenya. So one day, about 3 years ago, the Kenyan government went to the US ambassador, resident in Nairobi, and said, could we please get rid of that? Because it smells like hell. It poisons our water at home, and we just don't want it. We want to get rid of the blooming thing. So the ambassador is reported to have phoned or communicated with US with state. State went directly to USAID and said, this is what the Kenyan government has asked for. USAID immediately said, no, 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 we are not going to put any export to second-hand shoes to Kenya, and if the Kenyans dare, we will cut off aid. Guess what the Kenyan government had to do after that? And this is the force that we have. The UK has got a company, which I think is headquartered in Switzerland at the moment, called Trafigura. It has done exactly the same thing. It export toxic chemicals to the Ivory Coast. And the city of Abidjan, the capital, it used to be a beautiful, beautiful city. Apparently now, I've not been for quite a few years, smells to high heaven, and most of the water is polluted. So people are suffering as a result of toxic waste, chemicals, products and so on that have been exported to Abidjan or to other parts of the Ivory Coast. Because Trafigura is backed by Western powers who are saying to those countries, you can't protest. Okay, so those are just to give you a taste of some of the challenges. Okay, so in what we are doing. Okay, thank you very much. Now, okay, so we have China, we have Africa with a specific number of challenges, some made by its own growth, population, aridity, climate change, size, and so on. We have the West that imposes certain rules, and I put the extreme of it. Otherwise, you lovely people, half asleep, wouldn't listen to me and wouldn't think that what I've said has any weight. But it has. It has. Now, what does China have to offer? Okay. Democracy is for the birds. What matters is governments. You see, and this is the Chinese government is very clever. It never asks any questions about who is in charge. If someone is in charge, they deal with them. You know, democracy is not for China. China doesn't understand democracy, does it? Not the way we understand. You try to protest against what's happening to the Uyghurs or the Falun or whatever, you've had it, haven't you? Okay, so China understands the power of representation. So most of the big stadiums across Africa have been built by the Chinese and donated. But most of the work that is going on is by Chinese companies who are backed by their government, move in and discharge their work or the contracts that they've got. So the first challenge, which I put to you earlier on, is that of communications. The main roads in Africa now are being built by the Chinese. They are often of extremely poor quality, but I must confess, who cares? Why should the roads be to the latest standards? They are roads, they can be improved, they can be maintained. If you're going to go for the best Western standards, you are putting such burdens on poor countries that they cannot cope. It's a devil's choice, but I know what side I would be. So the second thing is that China can offer a comprehensive, coordinated approach by the state and the private sector. Why? Because China is a capitalist country, but a far better capitalist country than any of our Western democracies. Liberal capitalism, do you remember that? The end of the Cold War, and so on. The end of history, Francis Fukuyama. China uses state capitalism. It combines the state and capital, the ultimate power, and it can coordinate the approach in the way that we Europeans simply cannot imagine. And what happens if they don't repay, if the governments don't repay? They bloody well take over. Piraeus, okay? You probably have been to Piraeus recently or going to go to Piraeus. The port is owned by Chinese companies, not by Greeks. Ceylon, you know, the main port Colombo, beg your pardon, the main port in Sri Lanka is owned by the Chinese. More and more bits of land, quite big bits of lands, are going to be property of Chinese companies who are very happy to resettle the workers that they employ, because many of them are prisoners who have been let out of China and told, you have another 10 years in prison or you can go and work in Africa. You know, nice choice, isn't it? So they go. Once they've finished their sentence, they are allowed, they will stay there, they will bring their families, and they start little businesses. And they take over from small-scale traditional businesses in that part of the world. Now, then China is used to planning long-term, whilst our democracies are short-term, inevitably short-term, because our bloody politicians have got to be re-elected. So these poor bastards who stand for parliament, for governors and whatever, they are not going to think about 10 years, 20 years ahead, are they? But unless you think that way, you cannot build really effective railways, communication systems, you cannot build education systems that are going to last. So you look at 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. And China, don't follow democracy. We know best. It needs food for its people. And this is why it has gone into Brazil in a very, very big way, and it is going into China increasingly. The most important economy in sub-Saharan Africa is South Africa. When South Africa was recently asked by the West, where do you people stand on the Ukraine conflict? Are you with the West or are you with China? And apparently Cyril Ramaphosa said, we are not a bunch of idiots, and gave no answer. Very telling. So it is acquiring minerals and rare earth. There are 17 rare earth, and you, Glenn, you probably can list all of them, but some of them, lithium, strontium, and so on, we need for the next phase of our own development. And we don't have enough of it. China has virtual monopoly of it, because it is a part of the world that has got rare earth. It's also the country that is acquiring them, particularly in the DRC. The DRC is the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which always makes me laugh because it's not democratic, it's not a republic, and it was used, and I used to call it Zaire for the best part of 30 years. So it's going to dominate the world economy because of that, I'm quite certain. And it is a revenge on the West because China has been humiliated. I've been humiliated everywhere. Until 300 years ago, China was the most powerful nation on earth. And the European countries started to emerge. And now I think it's again the term. And there is resentment, and some of you will know these things better than me. There was an act, was it called the Chinese Exclusion Act, 1874? Under which Chinese immigrants were not allowed into the US. And that lasted until 1943, when the US and China were on the same side in the Second World War. Now that is an insult to the Chinese people, and the same way as it is an insult to the Chinese people when after the Second World War in the UK there were signs in the doorway say, no Irish, no Chinese, no dogs allowed. So China has plenty of reasons. Now, I'm not going to decide, because you're all extremely intelligent people, which way should Africa go. But I will stop here because I must have greatly, I have indeed, I do apologize. So to me, friends, those are the choices. Okay? Let's have a discussion.
Thank you very much. I have the microphone for questions. A question here in the back.
Thank you so much. I'm entirely depressed. You know, you talked about philanthropy, and you know what Brigitte, I'm over here, what Brigitte is doing.
I got the wrong specs. These are short, and I can't see you. Can't see you.
What Brigitte is doing is amazing. What the Gates Foundation is doing is amazing. But, well, okay. But how is philanthropy supposed to accomplish anything when you're talking about the kinds of challenges what the WTO is doing? I mean, it just feels hopeless. So what's the answer here?
Okay. The question will only take about half an hour to answer. The first one is, you see, Gates do fantastic. I mean, I'm sure he's got his heart in the right place, you know. My wife and I had the honor of meeting him very briefly. But he sees it from a particular point of view in dealing with a society which is the one that he knows. He doesn't quite understand any more than his former wife, Melinda, didn't understand. About when David Cameron was Prime Minister in the UK, there was a conference called at number 10 Downing Street, you know, where our Prime Minister lives. And the conference was about the role of women and so on in the future. So there were plenty of potential speakers. One organization that is in favor of abortion if the woman wants it, called the Brooks Group, says we work in many countries and we know that there are around 100 to 120,000 illegal abortions per year in the poorest countries in the world. Could we please participate in a discussion? And Melinda Gates, who was the one who kicked Bill Gates into setting up the foundation, said, we don't do abortion. We don't listen to the right people. That's the problem. Okay, more specifically, we need to start, for example, making an effort to talk to the people who matter, the women. Okay, that is, I received this morning a lovely long email that I was longing for days, of a bloke, a Malawian, who is out of favor with the government because he's of the wrong ethnic group. And he's trying to get into a university in the UK, and I've directed him in the right way. So I said, you know, you owe me now. So he does indeed, and he's repaying the debt by looking at projects in his part of the world, central Malawi, where local projects have been started by local people. And he gave me 6 or 7 that we can follow up. Because if a headmistress, for example, of a school for secondary level school, a school for girls, has started a garden to teach the women to understand a bit more of agriculture, and then she encourages the children, the teachers, the parents in the PTA to become involved, so that for a start, the children can grow enough food to have at least one decent meal per day. That to me is the right kind of philanthropy, and not the one of another organization called Mary's Meals that comes from Scotland. I have no idea where Scotland is, where they raise enormous amounts of money because, give me some money, please. Give us money. We want to ensure that every child in Malawi gets at least one meal a day. Huh? What philanthropy would you, young lady, go for? The self-sufficient, self-reliance, looking after yourself, or being the philanthropist, the white savior? You see, those are the choices. Don't go with the majority. Don't go with the Bill Gates Foundation and the likes. Challenge them. I did say no more than half an hour. Sorry.
Any other questions? Oh.
No.
Oh, yeah, one over there.
If no one asks anything, I feel that, you know, a situation in which a single person has attacked a mob.
Thank you for your broad overview of everything. And in our travels, we've seen the Chinese government football stadiums. Brilliant. You know, they
Yes.
get the attention of the people. Everybody
Yes.
loves them. And in return, they get the rare earths in somewhere, wherever they want them. How many have they built in how many countries?
I don't know, but there is a very good book that came out 3 years ago, 4 years ago, called Africa, semicolon, China's second continent. And have you read it? I think it said something like about 2 million Chinese have settled, which is far, far more than all the Europeans, all the Americans, anybody through the history of colonialization, etc., etc.
Sorry, a follow-up.
That's part two. They bring the workers in to build
Yes.
the stadium. They bring the workers in. So to what extent and in what countries are they doing this, colonization through population, just having their own people?
South Africa, Zambia, Ethiopia, Sudan, yes. Sorry, I don't know others, but I suspect that Tanzania, there was a Tanzania has got just one huge port, Dar es Salaam. Dar es Salaam is the biggest port along all of the Indian ocean side of Africa. It processes in a year what Singapore can do in 6 hours. It needs enlarging. The Chinese went over to Tanzania and said, "We'll do it for you." Okay, the Tanzanian government said, "What a brilliant idea!" So the Chinese started to do this, and the other, and then they said, "Oh, we must be allowed to do this, and the other." And the Tanzanian government said, "Bugger off, leave." And so the port is not going to be built. And that means that the whole of East Africa, inland countries in East Africa, Zambia, Malawi, Rwanda, Burundi, and so on, are starved of goods. There can be no commerce because there are no roads, there are no ships to transport the goods at the end of the day. I can't tell you, but it's a trend that is going to grow and grow and grow. There is a young, sorry.
I have a question here. 50 years is a very short period of time, depending on your perspective. I left Addis Ababa 50 years ago when Haile Selassie was imprisoned by the military.
Mm-hmm.
And I lived there for 6 years. Nothing's changed. I mean, there seems to be very little development. The country is worse off now than it was then. From what I've seen of the news reports, I've not been back there, but from what I've seen of the news reports, I don't know what the solution is for a country like that was, at the point I was there, reasonably well run by Haile Selassie, who was the Lion of Judea and, direct descendant of the Queen of Sheba. I mean, he owned the country. Military basically was, existed at his, at his disposal. When they overthrew the government, it was over.
Right. Now, if you're asking me what is the solution, well, I don't know is the solution because I've not been paid enough to give this talk to give you the solutions. Okay, no, look. Yes, Haile Selassie managed a country because he was a dictator, right? This is what you're saying as well. He was very clever. So the Israeli army was trained, I think, by the British. The Air Force, the Air Force was the British. The Americans trained their military. The Imperial Guard, that was the bodyguard of the emperor, that perhaps you might have remembered seeing guarding the palaces and so on, was trained by the Israelis. He made sure that there was no coordination of training so that he remained safe. Now, it was a totally unjust government, but what he did manage to do is that a small number of people were extremely well educated. What the military did, and I was about 10 years after you, I was 1980, 1981, we've been back since quite a few times. They provided education for the masses. That is the one positive thing that the military government introduced, okay? Now, they were totally, as you know, in the hands of the Soviets. Okay, so they ran the country as the Soviets told them, and eventually it was the huge famine that erupted. I was very marginally involved. If you remember, Do They Know It's Christmas and all of that in 1985. Now, since then, what the government has tried to do is to introduce democratic reforms, exactly the opposite of what Ali Selassie and then the military government has done. And this has led to a country unprepared for what it involved, more and more divisions, so that the ethnic wars that are very seldom reported now in the Western press that affect the North, where possibly 2 million people have died in the last 3 years, 4 years, in fights between the Tigrinian, the Eritreans, the Somalis, is because of the false sense that each country, each group has, that they have got to have their own, they've got to be in charge of the whole country. We do not allow, we do not encourage the kind of solution for the different African countries that Switzerland has organized, of allowing a canton, a level of democracy, a level of nation building that makes sense. And problems in the US has got that kind of challenge, but it certainly will not encourage countries to divide in what would be a different system of governance. And it will never happen. And this is why there is no hope for any country in Africa, in my view. There isn't.
Thank you.
Sorry, there is a young man here as well. Sorry.
I know today that we're talking about Africa, but I'm sure you are aware, as we are in Australia, of the creep of China across the southern Pacific Ocean, also in Cambodia. And these are very worrying to Australian government at the moment, particularly in the Solomon Islands. I don't know if you want to comment, but I just...
No, you're absolutely right. We were having a discussion earlier, I can't remember, I think earlier about this issue. You know, there has been an extremely powerful Chinese diaspora for centuries. Until recently, it was the part of the world that you're talking about, the Pacific kind of thing, but also the Philippines. You know, Mrs. Aquino was a Chinese lady, if I remember correctly, the president of the Philippines. So, and it is the Chinese overseas community, all of them with tremendously powerful ties back to the home country where their ancestors come from, where they will go and visit when they can, and so on. That when Deng Xiaoping announced in, was it 78, that he was going to liberalize imports, business, military, and so on, the four big steps, what is it called, the four freedoms. I don't know if you remember, you're too young to remember, but then it was the overseas Chinese community that took the lead, because they had been used to living as outsiders in those countries. As Glenn, in introducing me, said, I've worked with the Dutch aid government for 7 years in Indonesia. And it's again, the Chinese were massacred by the Indonesian majority at the time of Sukarno, because they were communist. They were not communist. They were Chinese, poor bastards. You know, they were Chinese, full stop. But a number of them saved themselves by becoming Christians. It is those with the greatest capacity for enterprise. And they are the ones who have revolutionized China. Now, sorry, this young man, shall we have this in one or two more?
Why don't we just do two more, and then
Two more,
we have a
okay.
reception, so there's plenty of time to ask Benny questions at the reception.
About 100 years ago when I was in college, I took a course called
No. It was only 20 years ago.
The Economics of Less Developed Countries. And
Yes.
the absolute conclusion was is democracy will not work in a less developed country. You need to have a force to create the people to save. Saving equals an investment. The real question is, will the dictator be benign or malignant. Isn't that where we are?
Yes. Yes, you were
Simplistically.
taught by very clever people of my generation, obviously.
But that's where we are.
Yes, yes. Unless we do something about it, not allowing sit back on our asses, on our behinds. We've got to start moving and doing things. Individual commitment, long term. What Brigitte is doing, what other people are doing. There are some superb examples of dedicated people who have stayed there, worked in their communities, and cared about the community, but done it not because they're Presbyterian or Adventist or Pentecostalist or Catholic or whatever, because people matter. You might remember, sorry, Abel, you might remember, if you are that old, a British economist called Fritz Schumacher, who wrote a book, Small is Beautiful. Do you remember it? Yeah. Okay. Well, he said the second title, or what is it called? The subtitle is Economics as if People Mattered. Sorry.
Last question.
There was a lady there, I thought.
What I've heard, I agree with totally. I'm just wondering why you would suggest individually start trying to do something as opposed to support the Chinese and get the place really up. Seems that they've got the strategy, they've got the logic, they've got the manpower, they got the cash. Why wouldn't we, living in Africa or around Africa as you do, in order to get Africa up and going? It sounds like that would be the way to go, thinking long term as opposed to short term. And if we take one individual, not the Gates, but whoever we want to do, a group of one individuals isn't going to overpower a people of 1.2 billion people who are well managed in terms of doing something.
Because I think that our style of living, if we are determined to be decent and to fight for some kind of equality of opportunities, is a far better way than the way of China.
But can it be stopped?
No. No. Not unless there are many individuals who actually understand the issue. If World Vision, for example, and I apologize if you're one of the donors to it, huge multinational organization that works all over the world, if it started to concentrate in one or two countries and stay there for 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, you would have change. But when you are World Vision with the turnover of $550 million, you are Greenpeace, it's bigger than that. Médecins Sans Frontières, bigger than that. The Mercy Corps, bigger than that. And so the Red Cross. And you all have individual programs in the same country, so that you're overlapping and fighting one against the other. None of those can stop growing. You have got staff committed. You have headquarters to pay for, 4x4 Land Rovers, etc. You become businesses. We have lost the sense of commitment.
But that would argue all the more for supporting the Chinese effort.
No, it doesn't. I don't want to support the Chinese.
But
because
you've just defined it.
If I were a Uyghur or a Catholic, I wouldn't want to be there. Sorry.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Benny. Everyone, 6 o'clock reception in the plaza.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.